How many of you, just out of curiosity, how many of you have, how frequent are your board meetings? And I don't mean like stand-up meetings, I mean scheduled, you're all around a table. Just yell them out, let me hear. Once a month? Quarterly?
I haven't had one yet.
Okay. Are you new?
I've been there for almost a year, but the church has just recently changed to a district-affiliated church.
Okay, you're revitalizing, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know who's ready to serve on it.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm doing a leadership Sunday school class and Wednesday night class to help me identify
who the leaders are. Yeah, that's good. Well, God bless you for that. You know, I always tell our DA churches, you know, the DA level, they're in most cases they're advisory boards to another board. So, you know, you don't have that pressure of having to have people necessarily be fully, what I would call fully qualified. But I always tell pastors, start meeting with people. Even if you don't start acting like you were a sovereign church.
Function as if.
Yeah, and it deepens your bench. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Want to thank all of you guys for being here. And we've got some notes for you that I'll give you an autoresponder again if those of you, I don't know who's coming and going or who's new, but I created a autoresponder that will give you access to the notes you have in PDF format, and they're interactive, so you can type in those PDFs. You have to click around and find that blank, and you can start typing and it'll save in there. But here's how to get a hold of that within a couple seconds here. If you pick up your phone and you send a text to this number, I'll give it to you, 720-650-7575. I'll read that number again, 720-650-7575. And then in the body, like the text part, just pretend like you're going to text a message, but only put one word, the word helper, HELPER, okay? And so here's what our goal is today. Our goal is to address, you know, why are board meetings important? We want to address what are the most common ways they go off the rails, if you can give me your word, I'd like to just speak openly and tell you some of the crash and burns. Most of the time, if I'm called in to help make sense of a mess, it's usually related to boards or board meetings or the lack of them, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the last thing is how can you keep your board meetings anticipated? That's the key word, anticipated. And I wish I love boards. Everybody's different. My governance model, the church that I pastored had 13 board members. And I love big boards, but that's not everybody's cup of tea. There's lots of advantages to that, but I want to tell you, I am a believer in a church board. If you have problems with the board, it's usually not because you have a governance that requires a board. It's because you're not vetting the people around that table, okay? And we'll talk about that, and I'll give you some suggested steps to a vetting process and those kinds of things. So let's talk, and at any time, help me out. At any time, please raise your hand if you got a question, if you got something to toss in, raise your hand and feel free to interrupt me. Does that sound good? I want you to interrupt me because my wife does it all day long and I'm used to it. All right. So from my perspective as a superintendent, I want to give you what I believe to be the reasons why board meetings are so important. And I will say this as a catch-all phrase. When I go into a church that is struggling, I usually ask, my first question is, tell me about your board meetings. Whether a church has regular board meetings, and I'll move out if we need to incorporate some tables here, whether a church has board meetings or not, really shows you the depth of the leadership community in that church. When I am called in to help a church find a pastor, and that pastor has left and the church has not had board meetings, that means I don't have a mature group of believers to help in the search process, and it makes the search way longer. We average 5.5 months in the Rocky Mountain Ministry Network. We have a whole system and resources that we use to get pastors in. The national average is 18 months. If a church has not been having a board meeting, I'm looking at over a year. If you don't have a leadership community established, and that church is going to decline in that year, that's going to be a really tough fill. So that's why that is so important. So let me talk about why. And the first one is what I would call organizational maturity. The frequency and the regularity of agenda-driven board meetings is the key indicator for church health for me. I don't know one growing church in my district that does not have regularly scheduled board meetings, okay? Every church in decline, I can say this 100% certainty, every church plateaued or declining, they all have one thing in common. It's not the only problem that church may have. They do not have regularly scheduled board meetings. And they may have stand-up meetings, hey, in the back of the church, we got to do this, we need the water line fixed. And I'm not talking about that. I'm saying a schedule that's put out and everyone on the board knows where it's at. So for me, regularly scheduled board meetings is a key indicator for the organizational maturity of the church. What does that show me? It shows me the length and depth of their leadership pipeline. If you don't have board meetings, you're not developing leaders for when you're not there. The greatest test of leadership is, does the church survive us moving on someday? All of us are interim pastors, if you think about it, right? All of us are interim pastors. And so when I go into a church that does not have board meetings, I know they don't have developed leaders. And that church is not mature organizationally. I don't mean spiritually, I mean organizationally. So that's huge. It also tells me about organizational integrity. Now hear me on this. I don't know a lot of pastors that don't have integrity, okay? Most of the pastors I work with have integrity. But just because the pastor and the people around the table have integrity, that does not mean the church has what is called organizational integrity. Board meetings are super, super important because they have accountability structures, okay? They have minutes that document decisions. They have follow through with decisions that are made. And so if your church is going to be mature, if it's going to grow, you need regularly scheduled board meetings. I really can't tell you in my network an example of a growing church that does not have regularly scheduled board meetings. That's your team huddle. Can you imagine if you were a football team and you just had all these people and you didn't have a huddle and everybody went out and did their own thing? That's what happens to churches that do not have regularly scheduled board meetings. And also the capacity for collaboration. When you have regularly scheduled board meetings, your board begins to develop a chemistry. You have certain people that bring certain things to the table. You realize you're a family. You learn how to make decisions together. So I'll tell you why this is so important. If your bylaws say that the board becomes the nominating committee when the pastor leaves, and it says the board is the nominating committee, I get really excited when I read that in church bylaws because I know that group already has chemistry working together, making big decisions. So that pastoral transition is going to be shorter just because of the fact that they have regularly scheduled board meetings. So you develop team skills in a boardroom. We'll talk a little bit later about how to process some of that, but the last is organizational memory on this issue of organizational maturity. That your church does more people know about stuff than just you, and that's called organizational memory. So you're not having to tell every single person what to do, how to do it, give them steps to do it, because now you have a leadership community called the board that has that organizational memory together, okay? I have seen some really crazy situations where I remember getting one church, the pastor left, they did not have board meetings, discovered that the church had $90,000 of tax fees because they did not pay tax. It was over 20 years. No one on the board knew that. No one in the church knew that. There was no organizational memory because they weren't meeting. So to be honest, the last pastor was only there 2 years. He didn't know about it. It all came to be when the church tried to buy property and discovered there was a lien on their property. So organizational memory is important, and it comes through board meetings. So maturity. The second reason it's important is legal accountability. Now, you may not like board meetings, okay, but it's part of what we have to do as pastors. We have to develop those skills. Why? Because it's the law. You are a nonprofit corporation. You are required by law to have board meetings. You must do it. Your district requires you, if you're a DA church, to have advisory board meetings or whatever are they advisory boards here? Is that what you call them? Okay. Your bylaws require them. If you have bylaws, they are going to stipulate that the board has to meet. It's not a choice for us as leaders, whether we do or not. It's a legal obligation that in your state and in the federal government, if you are going to be a nonprofit corporation, you must have meetings, okay? Let me give you a third one. I've already talked about this, organizational integrity. So organizational integrity is not the integrity of the individuals in the church. That's very rarely in question. But does your church document decisions? Do you have business meetings? Do you have minutes? Okay. Do you have things like financials that are distributed to your board members before the meeting? Okay. We're going to talk about what makes board meetings derail in a moment. But these are all really, really important things. Come on in, guys. So what you want to remember is that for your organization to have organizational integrity, you've got to have meetings. So let me give you an example of a couple of things that I run through quite often. Some of our rural churches get in the bad habit of not having board meetings, and they just kind of have what I call stand-up meetings. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the pitfalls of a no later on today of a no huddle offense, and when not just your board but your leadership community. What happens when you try to get on the field and not have a play? You just go straight to the line of scrimmage. A lot of pastors lead that way, and what happens is when there comes a time, and the payback for that is when you least expect it. So let me give you an example. We had a church that was a PAC church just last month of another church, and this pastor loved that he was a PAC. You know, he was under another church. He wasn't having board meetings, even though he was an hour away from the mother church. He was not having board meetings. That church decided, well, to build a new building, we got to streamline things. We're releasing all of our PACs to become sovereign churches. Okay, they said to the one PAC, it was about 80. We need you to buy this building. We're going to give you a steal on it. We need you to buy it from us. We need to move forward. That church could not get a loan. They didn't have 2 years of financial statements. They didn't have 2 years of minutes. All the stuff that banks want, they didn't have. You get to title, and then a title company looks at everything, and they're like, this isn't an organization. This is more like a club. That's called organizational integrity, when you have minutes, board meetings, and these types of things. So we've talked about 3. Let me talk about the 4th reason, and that is healthy communication. And so I'll move back here, folks. Pretty soon I'm going to be outside, and you guys are going to be having a blast. That's right. So something happens in board meetings that does not happen without them. And that is healthy communication. I love the King James Version of 1 Corinthians 1:10. It says this. Paul says, that ye may speak the same thing. That ye may speak the same thing. Is Paul saying that he wants unity to be we all say the same words and repeat them? No. Paul is saying you have unity on your agreements. You all are on the same page. Okay? And that happens in board meetings. Without regularly scheduled board meetings, communication dies in a church. You have things like lack of vision. People don't know the vision of the church. Your leaders don't know the vision of the church. So your board meetings become everybody representing their values, their desires, instead of knowing the big picture of the church. If you don't have board meetings, you don't have momentum. You don't have collaboration, people working together. I've learned over the years to love boards for accountability. I made a decision many years ago that accountability was going to be my friend. And I got to tell you, churches a church's stock goes up and down. There are seasons that churches are doing amazing, and every church, whether you're healthy or not, goes through rough patches. I shared with you about the building program that in the Great Recession was at 14 years ago. That we were running 1,100 people, and we went into a school, went down to 180 people. It was very, very difficult. The good news is that God enabled us to get back and even surpass that 5 years later. I never would have imagined it, but I want to tell you, it was board meetings that saved me, because when things get tough, God's people get weird. Amen to that? Do you know what I'm talking about? Let me give you an example. When we were in the building program, we had prepaid for a lot of materials. And so we were doing that to get good prices. However, when the Great Recession happened, the building, the bank went out of business. We lost our funding. Contractors went out of business. And boy, everybody was blaming somebody else. Everybody was blaming somebody else. And I remember several people in the church, a couple of things happened. You know, as Spirit-filled believers, sometimes we get weird and we over-spiritualize things in bad times. You know what I'm talking about? And I remember there was a group in the church that said, you know, boy, something must be wrong in pastor's life for this to be happening. You know, I was Jonah on the ship, right? Let's throw him overboard. And I had regularly scheduled board meetings. And I had 13 other men of integrity that had been elected by that church who stood by me because they knew how things were run. There were some that said, boy, you know, they didn't understand the financial impact that the recession had on the church, losing jobs, income drop, attendance, all these kinds of things. And some said, well, where's all the money that we raised for the building program? Is the staff embezzling money? None of those things gained traction because I was accountable to my board. Every single meeting, they had financial statements. They saw the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so you weather storms. Now, I've seen churches that neglect board meetings. And let me tell you what happens when that happens. People scatter. No one has ownership in it. So yeah, you can set up a structure where you're the king and you make all the decisions. But the fact of the matter is when you go through hard times, no one's standing with you. So let me make this application to the board. These board members to this day, I can hardly talk about them without getting weepy. We became a band of brothers. And I remember when we'd have staff come and go, and the good news is after we got into that building, God not only filled that sanctuary once, twice, but 3 times. But during the tough times, that board stood by me. How did they? We remember that we had a huge building payment. We had financed the construction through church bonds, which means church construction loans, you don't start paying until you occupy the building. Then the payment starts. Bonds, you pay right away. So I had in construction already making my large building payments. And boy, that was amazing. But I remember there was a couple of months that we really struggled. We were not going to be able to do that. We never once missed a payment. You know why? One of my board members in a meeting said, God told us to do this. I'm gonna empty my retirement account, and we're gonna make sure that this church thrives on our watch. The rest of us followed. And you know, I got to tell you, I don't mean this in any way to glorify man. It is God. When I drive by that building today, and I see the cars there, and I see the crowds there, I go back to that day where board members bled with me, and we got through the crisis and saw God's blessing on the other side because of the camaraderie and the vision that was shared in board meetings. If you got it, you understand it, say, I got it. Yeah. All right, we've talked about a couple reasons, healthy communication. Your leadership bench. The depth of your leadership bench is never going to be greater than the frequency of your board meetings. Because what you're doing is you are training leaders, even by meeting. You're training them how to make decisions together. You're training them about big picture, okay? I remember when I pastored in a small rural church, they had not had board meetings. And so when I came in the early days, everybody came to the meeting with an ask from their perspective. My wife works in the nursery. She says, we need this. I make a motion, we buy this. And the other board member, well, my granddaughter's in the youth group and we need this. So what happened is the church, because they were not having meetings, they fell into an activist mode where board members thought their role was to represent their passions and not look after the interests of the entire church. So when you have meetings, the longer you have regularly scheduled meetings, the more you train people. We're not here to represent our passions. We're here to govern the needs of the entire church. So you have less conflict. You make decisions as a group together, and your bench, you mature leaders, your bench lengthens. Number 6 is church growth. I honestly believe that a church will not grow beyond the capacity of its leadership community. So the only way you can develop that is to develop board members. And I'm going to share some links and things with you guys. Those of you that are like, man, I don't know how to do that. Man, I've got some stuff that'll really help you that will cost you absolutely nothing. So we've talked about why they're important. Let's talk about how board meetings go off the rails. Okay? How many of you have had a bad board meeting? Okay? All right. How many of you are lying? Raise your hand, all right? Man, I've had my fair share of board meetings. And let me tell you why they go off track. And it isn't about because of a family in the church. It isn't about because of people. The number one reason is there's no formal vetting process. Okay? You cannot wing nominations to your board, whether it's an advisory board or whether it is an official board. You've got to have a vetting process. And so here's what I think leaders need to do. I gave you some links in your notes to some documents that you can customize. But man, I had Bill Vickery, who was a great thinker, organizational thinker, my superintendent in my 20s, taught me this, that the important thing is not the agenda, it's who's around the table. And getting the right people around the table is important. Not everyone is fit to be a board member. And I don't mean that like qualifications or even ethic-wise. Some people just aren't geared to be part of group decision making. They're independent thinkers. They want everybody to do what they want. They get in a meeting and they want to convince everybody their way. They're not wired to be part of a collaborative process. So what you've got to do is you've got to find people who qualify, who have the temperament, they support your vision, they have a good reputation in the church, they have biblical characteristics, and these kinds of things. So when I pastored, even in a rural setting, the same process I had in a small rural church is the same process I use in a church of 12 and 1,300 people. It's 7 steps. And my philosophy was, I can work with anyone who gets through these 7 steps. I don't care who they are. I don't care if they're male or female. I don't care what nationality they are. If they get through these 7 steps, then I can work with them. That's what you want. What you don't want is these kind of idea sessions where people just throw out a name, and that all of a sudden that person is nominated. So you want to make sure you get people around your table that are able to be board members. So here's what I have found. I have found that small business owners struggle on boards. Most of the ones I've known struggle on boards. Why? Because they walk into work every single day. They're the boss. They get what they want. They never have to compromise. They're a small business owner. They bring that into the boardroom. So their job is to get what they want. They don't know how to collaborate. They don't have to compromise. I have found that sometimes CEOs are not engaged because they're so busy. But in the middle of that are people who are middle managers. They have a boss over them and they supervise people under them. These people usually have great temperaments to be decision makers on a church board because they're used to following and leading at the same time. I call it ambidextrous leaders. They can follow and lead at the same time. So your nominating process helps you identify those people. Now I gave you some links. Do you see that on your, is it on your page, or I don't think it's on the slide, but on your page, you see those links? Yeah. The electronic version, when you click that, it's going to take you to every one of those. Now the first one describes those stages. You can customize it to what you want. The one form explains to the board, hey, we're meeting, and this is how we're going to do this. We're going to go through these 7 stages. One page is where every board member confidentially outside the board rates nominees on all the biblical characteristics of leadership. Much reservation, some reservation, no reservation, recommend, highly recommend. People turn those in anonymously. We're all around a table. I sit there, and then when we see reservation checks, if there's more than 2 or 3 people, we say, okay, we got to pause now and we need to talk about this. Boy, that process has saved me tremendously as a leader, because people are allowed to express their opinions about a person without having to, when I say people, I'm talking your board, if they're the nominating committee or the nominating committee, whoever that is. And then we only talk about concerns. That's when people can be open. I remember one year we discovered that someone who the entire board, except for one person, thought was qualified, and one person meant checked much reservation. And I thought, wow, we need to talk about this. Turns out the person on the board had worked with this individual, and they were in the process of being fired for embezzlement. Okay, how would we have known that had we not had a process? Okay, those processes go through. The first thing we do that I recommend is you set a standard for your board for financial giving. Tithe, not missions, not youth. What is their tithe? And I got to tell you, I'm a believer in this. You might say, I don't believe the pastor should know what people tithe. I would push back on that. Our job is to bring spiritual maturity to people's lives. You would be concerned if someone was never reading their Bible, if they were never praying, if they were never expressing the other spiritual disciplines. So why in the world would we not want to be concerned that someone sitting at one of the highest levels of leadership is also giving and practicing stewardship? If someone is not mastered stewardship, they're just not ready for a leadership position. So what you got to decide now is, how do we know if they're tithing? Well, you really don't. But what my board would do every year, we would set a minimum threshold. And we'd say, if you were retired, I'm sorry, folks, I'm like turning back to you. If you were retired and you owned your home in this community, in this zip code, what is the lowest someone could make and have be retired, own their home and whatever? And those numbers will vary depending on what community you're in. We would start our process by nominating every single member. We would give that list to the accounting department, and we would say, cross off anyone's name, or the bookkeeper, cross off anyone's name who does not tithe. We're not talking about missions. We're not talking about people giving to things that are important. No, the biblical tithe below this point, okay? They'd give us a list. Then we'd start vetting that list and taking that list through the first 7. Why did we start with the money? Is it because money is the most important? No. It's just really embarrassing if you don't start there and you find out at stage 7 that person doesn't tithe, and then you've got to tell them, hey, we've been meeting with you, but this is off now because of your stewardship. So this way a person never really knows if they were not nominated or not. But you need a process. You need to get the right people around the room. Any questions about the process? The steps are in those links for you, but any questions? Yeah.
How would you address a very diverse economic area? Like the area that I live, it's a resort, lake community.
Yes.
And there's people that have a single white trailer and it looks like a junkyard.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, the economics is extremely diverse going on. So how would you address something like that?
Yeah, the tourist communities are like that. Boy, there's like, I would go on the low end and make your minimum by what you think on the low end of that is. And I want to say to you something that, I have a cohort every year that I train 16 to 20 young associates on how to be a lead pastor. And I really focus on this with them, that God will hold your whole church back if you have one person on that board that doesn't have the discipline of tithing. Why should someone who has not trusted God with their finances make decisions about everybody else's, right? So you want the right people around the table. I'm not saying it's all about money. We had the same thing. We had different extremes. So we went on the low end and said, boy, it would be really hard to live for X amount of money. and then we would put that as a threshold. Any other questions? I thought I saw a couple. Yeah.
Your thoughts real quick on going into an established church that isn't doing much of this right
Yeah.
to begin that
Been there.
around without doing it.
Been there. Who nominates now? Is it the?
Nominating it's two people elected by the congregation, pastor appoints a board member and a member at large.
Okay. Yeah. So I've been there. Went into a church. I used this system in a rural church, but then when I was later on in years, I went to more of a metropolitan area. It was exactly like you said, exactly. And I just said to the board, "Hey, I need your help. We want to think long term. We want to think long view. We need a process." And I presented to the board the 7 steps and said, "Would you, as the board, feel comfortable approving this for our 7 steps?" I also would talk about, summarize each step in the business meeting. And boy, I tell you, that reduces a ton of conflict, because you always have these vocal people that want to be on the board. And then when people find out the reasons, it's basically at the end, they're either unqualified or unwilling. And some just say, "My work's too demanding, I can't do it." That's fine. But at least you have found that out in the process. So I would have the board approve it. And of course, you can customize that list. Any others? Formal vetting process. Boy, I got to tell you, every church conflict I walk into usually is a church that does not have a vetting process for the board. They just brainstorm names, or someone throws out a name and that person's nominated. They may be popular and get elected, but they may be unqualified.
How would you address a vetting process that is currently determined by your bylaws to be the members of the congregation?
Interesting.
The nominating vetting process.
So do the members turn in names, or? Okay. And then does it say anything about what happens after they turn in those names? Like, do they automatically go on the ballot?
Then the board members exclusively, without the pastor, vet the names.
Interesting. Are you a member of the board?
Chair.
The chair, okay. Yeah, so there's a couple things I would recommend there. Number one, some boards get into the habit of thinking the board is the board members and then the pastor. It's not 2 groups. Your bylaw, by your very title of chairman, you are a board member and should be in every meeting. And to deprive you of that is to deprive the rights of a member, which Robert's Rules says we can't do. So that board, would that board be able to adopt a process to vet names from the congregation?
Not without modification of bylaws.
Okay. Yeah, I would do that. I would say change your bylaws to say a process as determined by the board. That way you could change it over time and stuff. But yeah, I get concerned when boards meet without the pastor, or they think, no, if you are the chairman of that board, it is a violation of parliamentary procedure for you not to be informed and be in every meeting and exercise your right as a member. If this gentleman was a member of my board and I decided, hey, we're going to have a meeting, and I tell these guys about the meeting and don't invite him, we have violated his rights as a member. We've broken the law. So it's a really important issue. Okay?
I have a question.
Yeah.
If you have a church like Chris's that accepts board nominations from the body,
Yes.
and the nominations are vetted by the board, and you have someone who doesn't qualify, I know you mentioned earlier that if you check their tithing record and you take them off, they would never know. But when you have nominations from the church body,
Yeah.
they know, or sometimes they know.
Yes.
And so do you have some kind of, how do you tell a nominee that they don't qualify and are therefore not going to be considered?
So I think putting the financial screen as the first step saves a lot of that conflict. But I think that if your bylaws say that someone's automatically nominated from the floor, I would, in this culture, I would not recommend that. I would recommend that you amend the bylaws to say that they are nominated by a process determined by the board, because we have people who are trying to get from lifestyles that we would not agree with, who their goal is to get inside the leadership of a church and create a lawsuit, or so I would make sure that that's at the front end, but it's by the board. Now, when I read it, I remember there was one individual just made everybody know he wanted to be a board member and he never was. But when I started telling the board the steps very quickly, step 1 is a tithe, step 2, I'd say we've interviewed everyone who's gotten to the stage 7 about their willingness and availability or qualifications. So if someone's name's not here, they're either unwilling or unqualified. And boy, that just stopped a lot of murmuring and stuff, because people saw the steps and they knew, okay, there's a good reason. But I wouldn't put the financial screen in the middle or the end. It's hard.
Even if it's not a financial thing, if there's another reason for disqualifying them.
Yeah.
How do you relay that to them?
So the last 2 stages are the pastor meeting with that person personally. And I gave you guys a link to a little worksheet I'd take to those meetings, and I would ask, I think it is 8 questions of them. And there were a lot of times I'd find out people, maybe they weren't filled with the Holy Spirit. Maybe they said, hey, my marriage is not good. This isn't a good time for me. So that meeting with me, I think, was before the final stage that the board would approve the final nominees. And that saved, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's a great way to provide pastoral care too, when you find those. But there's no way to avoid the difficult conversations. It's important that you be willing to have those as a leader, or you're going to have board meetings that aren't productive. Any other questions on that point? The process? All right. So the next thing about why board meetings don't go off track is, on that first point, let me park here for one more minute. I'll give you a really current example. We had a church in our network that was not doing well. A new pastor went in about 5 years. It is amazing. I mean, the guy has turned the place around. It is full, but he is getting horrible resistance from 2 board members. And these people, I actually knew one of them. He did some work in my house. But growth does a weird thing to people. They start losing influence, and they're not sure how they're going to deal with that. And so I went in and met with the board, heard their side, the pastor's side. Everybody was in the room. And I found out that the ringleader of trouble was just 2 years ago was saved. Okay? He loved his pastor, and the pastor had no reservations about him because he thought, this person loves and supports me. The fact of the matter was, this person was not spiritually ready. They had come from a life of previous drugs and alcohol, not recent, but they just had some issues that their temperament was not compatible in a collaborative environment. Had this church had a screening process, I think some people could have spoke into the pastor's life and said, Pastor, let's wait and see how this person does in 4 or 5 years. So a nominating process, that's the number one reason. If you remember anything from today, remember that if the number one reason a board meeting goes south, it's because of a lack of a nominating process. The wrong people are around the table, all right? Second thing is that there is no agenda that is distributed before the meeting, okay? You want to save time in your meeting. Boy, our presbytery meetings are an hour and a half long. My board meetings were about an hour long. Why? Because they got a docket explaining everything before the meeting. We didn't come to the meeting to download information and teach people. Everybody had read that stuff before the meeting. We came to interact and make decisions. So the meeting was talking about things, not downloading. So meetings, if you just walk in a meeting and hand the agenda to people, you're gonna have a long meeting, because getting agenda to them before, it brings some disciplines to the table. How many of you have noticed that there's certain board members that always have ideas that are not good ideas in the meeting, right? I think we should do this. Well, if you have steps, and I give you an example in your links, to how things get on the agenda, you have time to vet those things before they even get on the agenda. There's a process. But getting that agenda out before That says, here's what we're going to talk about. Okay? Yeah.
What's your goal for before? Like, how much time do you want to give them to process?
For me, it's 5 days, 5 full days. And that's, I mean, that has been when I was in a rural church, and that has been when, you know, I was building a $16 million campus. The board got all that stuff before. Now, obviously, there's times in your life cycle that those dockets are you're gonna have to put contracts in there for them to see beforehand, these kinds of things. Sometimes they're thicker than others. But you will shave a ton of time off your meetings if you stop your meetings from you being you explaining things to the board and you giving them agenda beforehand. When they walk in, you adopt the agenda. That's the plan. So now anything that comes up goes on next month's new business, not in that meeting. So you're really getting streamlined. Make sense? Okay. Again, I want to assure you, if you're here in a rural church, a small church, I did this when my first church had 35 people. And I did this when my church was larger. But what it does is it enables you to make good decisions. You're not jumping. I remember when I became soup, our presbytery would be like, I think we should sell this property. And I'm like, you want to sell a $500,000 property on something we haven't even studied or looked at, you know? So now we have a process by which we make decisions and agendas, okay? So you want to get into that discipline of getting your agendas out beforehand. You might say this. You might say, well, if they see what I want to do before the meeting, they may say no. And I want to challenge you with this philosophy. If people can't say no, then yes doesn't matter anymore. Okay? As leaders, we have to be willing to make ourselves accountable to a group. If I can't get, when I pastored, we rewrote our bylaws. I gave my board the ability to let me go. I don't want that stuff going before the church if there's ever problems. I worked too hard to build that church. I'd rather leave quietly and see the church continue to thrive. But if I can't get 2/3 of my board to support me on something, I got bigger problems, right, than that decision. And so by putting the agenda out, I want to propose you will have people that respect you more because they see that you're wanting to be collaborative, okay? There's always a trump card pastors have. I've never found this to fail. If I felt the meeting or a decision was going in a direction that wasn't good for the church, I would say to my board, folks, man, I just don't have a peace about this yet. Can we pray about this for another month? Okay? Who is going to say no? I don't believe in prayer. So you have lots of options. Just by publishing an agenda doesn't mean you're losing options. You're actually gaining them. Okay, any questions? So you want to get that agenda out first. Fourth reason boards go off the rails is they are not trained or equipped for success. The office of deacon, which most churches embrace, even if they don't call them deacons, the scriptures they quote for board members are deacons, is a spiritual role. Okay? In biblical times, it says they waited on tables. I mean, those are overqualified table waiters, right? I mean, moral, marriage, all these different things. So it's really, really important that that when you are in those board meetings, you are training your board. Now, in your notes, there is a link that I'm gonna hook you up with, and it is one of the best board training resources out there that I know of. Dick Hardy from Church University puts out a series. It's pretty expensive, but our district purchased it and makes it available to all of our churches. I've given you a link to 10 of those sessions that are for free. Okay, you can just click it. They're only 10 to 12 minutes long. They're great things to do to start your meeting. So you have to train your board on how to be better board members, okay? They are not born with those skills. You have to train them on that. And they are amazing. Here, one session I love is what is called the self-policing board. I love this. You know, I used to tell my board, listen, I can't be the guy running around telling people you can't do this. You can't use the church for a birthday party. No, you can't do this. You can't do this. You can't take the chairs to another state because you have a family reunion. You know, you can't. If I'm the guy always slapping people's hands as the spiritual leader, they're not going to receive from me when I'm ministering them on Sunday morning. We all need to police. And so when you train your board that way, especially with other board members. When another board member gets out of line, well, this session says the other board members should bring that person into accountability, not just the pastor, okay? This is amazing stuff. So you've got a link to that. I don't want to park there, but you're welcome for those 10 sessions. They're free. Watch them beforehand. Make sure you agree with them and those kind of things. So the last one is lacking chairmanship. When I skipped 6, didn't I? Lack of pre-meeting planning. We talked about that already. 7, the reason is they go off boards is lacking chairmanship. Listen, I want to encourage you. I know you're a pastor, and I know that you're not called to be a parliamentarian or to master Robert's Rules of Order, but there are skills about chairmanship that will save you a ton of heartache that you need to learn, okay? When I was younger, my superintendent handed me a copy of Robert's Rules of Order. He said, you have 3 years to prepare. You're going to chair the parliamentary committee. I was terrified, okay? I read that book. I learned more about how to get things done from Robert's Rules of Order than I ever did in Bible college. So for instance, have you ever had a board member say, I want the minutes to show that I disagreed, okay? Have you ever had a board member constantly speak against the same thing in the meeting? Someone speaks for it, they keep speaking against it. Parliamentary procedure says you're not allowed to speak twice to an issue if someone else still wants to speak. Parliamentary procedure says that the minutes record what a board did, not what was said. So some of these things about just sharpening your chairman skills will save you a ton of conflict and enable you to function better. Now, no one can read 700 pages of Robert's Rules of Order. You're not going to fall over speaking in tongues reading Robert's Rules of Order. Okay? There is a short paperback that the same people that are the custodians of Robert's produced. It's called Robert's Rules in Brief. Small paperback. It will give you 90% of what you need to know to chair a good meeting. So take it and read 1 chapter a month, okay? And you'll have some good chairmanship skills, okay? For instance, you can't make it's not wise to make a motion as a chairman, but I keep meetings along by saying the chair would entertain a motion if someone's willing to make that motion. Is someone willing to make that motion? Every time, boom, boom, move seconded. Constantly moving the meeting forward. You learn those things by investing in your chairmanship skills. If you got it, say I got it. All right, let's move quickly. I only got 15 minutes left. I want to talk to you about how to keep your board meetings anticipated. I got to tell you, one of the things that I've worked the hardest as a leader is to make people regret missing a board meeting. And our board meetings are fun, they're exciting, but it takes some planning to make them that way. And the first thing I would say is you've got to budget the time in every meeting. So you know what needs to be discussed. You want your board dealing with the most important issues up front, not 2 hours later when they're tired. So you have your agenda, right? And what I do is I start the meeting by saying, hey, we've adopted this agenda as a rule, but not necessarily a guide. I want you to know, I want you to circle number 1 and number 6. Those are the most important things that we're going to talk about tonight. If we don't get to all the others, they'll just be moved to new business next month, okay? Now you're determining what gets attention. So if there's something on the agenda that a board member wants and you know it's not good for the church, but you want to talk about budget first, or you as the chairman can suggest that. And most people don't know that they can say, no, we want to vote on this as a guide. They will not say that. So what you need to do is circle the things that are important to you and make sure you're getting your board to address those when they're fresh and creative and not tired. Does that make sense? Have you ever been in a meeting too long and you get to the end and you got no gas? Well, new business is usually the last thing on a traditional agenda, and those are the most important items. So by making a motion to accept the agenda as a guide, but not necessarily a rule, gives you as the chairman to bounce around that pre-published agenda, dealing with what you think needs to be why you got people fresh. Any questions? So budget that time. Second is serve snacks. Man, as someone who's got people love to eat. How many of you know what I'm talking about, right? Listen, I want to be skinny. I I think the second coming of Christ is a lot like losing weight. I believe it can happen. I want it to happen. But if it ever does, I'll be shocked. You know what I mean? That's kind of how it is. So bring food. And I got to tell you, don't be afraid to take a break. We have corn toss, and we set them up indoors, outdoors. We take a 15-minute break in presbytery. I did it when I pastored, and we have these stupid trophies we ordered. And whoever wins gets to take that trophy home. They got to bring it back next meeting. And boy, everybody comes back from that break like they just walked in the room. They're that fresh all over again. Okay, so don't be afraid to make things light and to add some fun things that you're doing in the group. Serve snacks. Nothing worse than being in a meeting and there's no water, there's no coffee, there's none of this stuff. You want people to be in a great mood so they are excited about everything you want to do. Can you say amen? Amen. Some of you are going to go serve steaks now at your board meetings. 3 is, this is powerful. Invite a mystery guest. Invite someone from your community to come into your board meeting for 10 minutes and you interview them about their role in the city or the town. Boy, I'll tell you, you want to earn credibility in the city and also get your board connected with needs in the community. Bring in a mystery guest. Bring in a new family to your church or an existing family. Have them give their testimony in 10 minutes about how they were changed or transformed or blessed by the church in some way. Let the board see the wins that you're getting. Celebrate wins. I start every meeting celebrating wins. Okay, this is the great things that has happened. And so bring people in. If you get a letter, an email about someone said, Pastor, man, Sunday you preached on this, I went home and this happened in our life. Share that with your board. Share wins so that they can put challenges into perspective. If you got it, say, I got it. The mystery guest is a powerful thing. And the next one under mystery guest is move your board meeting. Move your board meeting outside the church. Go to a library. Go to a youth center. Rent a room somewhere. It's like $20 to rent. And get your meeting outside. There was our church was very instrumental during the Aurora Theater shooting in bringing healing to the city. We had a podcast studio, and within an hour of the shooting, we had counselors, over the internet going to people in our city and the city personnel, the police, and these kinds of things. So I brought my board meeting to the memorial that the city put up for those people that were shot in that thing, and we had our board meeting right there in one of the meeting rooms. It's powerful, brings new life to your meeting. If you have some kind of unique nonprofit in your organization, go and have your meeting there. Get your board thinking outside the walls of the church, okay? Can I move to the next one?
Yep.
All right. We talked about 3, invite a mystery guest. 4 is include an outreach awareness component in your meetings. If I had to name one thing you might be saying to yourself, I wish I would have gave the rest of the story. I told you about how our church plummeted to 180 people during the Great Recession. I forgot to tell everybody that God did amazing things. I mean, 3 years later, the church was packed. We added 1 service, 2 services. If I had to tell you one thing that brought that about, it was us realizing that there were hurting people in the community and we need to get out and reach them. That's what turned the church around. That's what made the church grow above what it was before. And here's how it started. On your notes are a list of these questions. I would ask these questions once a week on Thursday. I'd work at the library, and I had a volunteer in the church that scheduled people to meet with me for 1 hour. And I would ask principals, school teachers, city leaders, I'd ask them, what are 3 things that you want to see your influence do? If it's a city council person, county personnel. How would you describe our city as a culture? What are our city's 3 greatest needs? What are 3 greatest dangers or threats to our community? What are our greatest strengths? What are 3 ways you've seen our community change over the past years? What are the different subcultures in our community? What needs do most organizations in our city feel unqualified to meet? Boy, that question changed the trajectory of our church. We realized there were 700 homeless elementary kids that we knew nothing about living on the streets. We kept hearing over and over again, homeless kids. We don't know what to do. They're kids of prostitutes, gang members, whatever. And we started an outreach in a local elementary school, a Sunday morning service for homeless kids. Went from 0 to 200 kids because we were ministering to them every week. It came out of asking these questions by mystery guests in our board meeting. How is a faith-based community actively involved in what you're doing? What are 3 things we can pray with you about? When you start exposing your board to even non-Christian organizations, let city council members come in for 10, 15 minutes, interview them. Boy, I'll tell you, they will start thinking differently about the budget, about what you should be doing in your community, and how you should be doing it. When I had my board meeting down in the hood in Aurora, we rented an old storefront in the worst part of town, and we set up tables, and we had board meetings there for 3 months. My board realized that we needed to be part of the solution in our city. We'd be in that meeting and we'd hear people walking by the sidewalk cussing, drunk people falling down, police coming. We realized that the needs in our city were much greater than we ever imagined because we had board meetings off-site. Make sense to you? Any questions before I address the last one? Last one is follow up on absenteeism. When a board member misses a meeting, don't just act like nothing happened. Even if it was a good reason, call them and say, man, I really missed you in the meeting. Do you have any questions? Let me update you on decisions that we made. If they forgot about the meeting or they've missed several meetings, call them every time they miss so they realize the importance of attendance. I'm not talking about laying a guilt trip. I'm saying just call and connect with them. I've had 2 occasions in 30 years of lead pastoring that I've had to ask people to step down because they missed too many meetings to have context, to make good decisions. Those are tough discussions to have, but you gotta have them. You gotta have them. Your board needs to be your best. I know I've raced through a lot of stuff here and you've got PDFs and resources. Any questions or comments before? I think we've got to be done in about 5 minutes here. Any questions? Yeah.
When it comes to the mystery guests and you're inviting them for 10, 15 minutes,
Yeah.
do you try and stack that like at the beginning of the meeting so that you're not running late, you have to stop conversation and so the mystery guest is there?
It's a great question. I've put them all over the place. I've put them as that creative break from the meeting. I put them at the end. I put them at the middle. But I think you know those people. You'll know like the mayor attended one of my churches. So he had great relationship. So I'd bring him in and we'd do him up front. If I was unsure about someone, I knew him well enough, I would put them the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes of the meeting. The main part is just telling them, hey, we only have 10 minutes. Budget 15, but tell your guests you got 10. So you can decide where that, if you have a light agenda, it's a great opportunity to bring in an outreach type thing and think out of the box. Move them around a little bit.
I guess I was asking more for if the board is having a heavier issue.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Do you want to make sure that the mystery guest comes in before that so you don't have to interrupt?
I would put them up front. I'm sorry, I missed you on that one. I was on the same page here. I would put them up front, and actually, if it is a tough decision, that will put, if it's a positive experience, it puts everybody in a great mindset to move forward. But make your meetings exciting. Don't make them boring. Okay? Any others? How many of you have meetings once a year? Okay, how many of you have them twice a year? How many of you have them 3 times a year? How many have them quarterly? Monthly? Awesome. Keep it up. Keep it up. As I said, when as a superintendent, when I deal with the church, they call with a problem, or if they're in transition, my first question is, how often does your board meet? That tells me immediately the depth of that bench and the width of that bench, and I know how big my challenge is. Okay? Can I pray for you folks? Father, we thank you that you've given us people to collaborate with in the church. People that are team members, people we need to respect, people we need to include. Help us to lead well, I pray. And I pray that you'll bless these folks with any truths that might have helped them, Lord, that are of your leading, that you will help them make the application in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.